So the rational zero test allows us to come up with a list of all possible rational zeros that a function could have. So sometimes they're going to give you a function and it's going to say list all the zeros or find the zeros of this function. And a lot of times to find the zeros we set the equation equal to 0 and then we try to factor. However, we can't think of the numbers that go into it because the function's too large or we just never factored by grouping that way or so on. So the rational zeros test allows us to make a list of factors and then test those factors by using our factor theorem, where if the remainder comes out 0, then that's a factor. So first thing is to list all the possible rational zeros, you need to know the constant term and the leading coefficient. So in this example, 1 would be my constant, and then my leading coefficient would be 1 as well. So the formula for listing all rational zeros is the factors of your constant term, and that constant term was 1, and then it's divided by the factors of your leading coefficient, which was also 1. So if I think about my factors of my constant, now I know that positive or only two numbers that multiply to 1 are 1 and 1. So you can also do positive and negative. So all your factors can be positive or negative. So on the top I'm going to put plus or minus 1. And then on the bottom for the factors of your leading coefficient is 1. So that's also plus or minus 1. So 1 divided by 1 is just 1, so all my possible rational zeros are either plus 1 or minus 1. And then to figure out what they are, what I would do is I would plug in 1 and do my synthetic division and see if my remainder is 0. And then I would also plug in negative 1 and see if my remainder is 0. Whatever one's 0 is a factor. If it's not a 0, then it's not a factor. So we're going to try that actually in this next example. So it says list all possible rational zeros, and then it wants to know what ones are the real zeros. So the first thing we do is we have to think about the factors of our constant and the factors of our leading coefficient. So if I'm looking at this equation, well, 4 is my constant term, and then negative 1 is my leading coefficient. So I'm going to make a fraction. So these are factors of my constant. And we said the constant was 4. And then we're going to divide it by the factors of my leading coefficient. And that was negative 1. So if you think about the factors of 4, that means two numbers that multiply to 4. So that would be plus or minus 1, plus or minus 2, and plus or minus 4. The factors of 1 are plus or minus 1. So now I take each part of this. So 1 divided by 1 is just 1. 2 divided by 1 is just 2, and then 4 divided by 1 is just 4. So I have three different factors, plus or minus 1, plus or minus 2, plus or minus 4. So I actually have 6 possible zeros. So now to figure out which ones are the real zeros, you have to plug in each of these numbers into synthetic division. So I'm going to start with 1. So I put my leading coefficients here. So since it's mixing x cubed and x, make sure you put your zeros in. We drop down this first number. 1 times negative 1 is negative 1. Add that to 0. You still get negative 1. 3 plus negative 1 is 2. 2 times 1 is 2. And I get a remainder of 6. So since it has a remainder of 6, it's not a factor. So then I have to try another one. So let me try negative 1. So negative 1, 0, 3, 0, 4. Same process, synthetic division. Drop down negative 1. Negative 1 times negative 1 is 1. Negative 1 times 1 is negative 1. 2 times negative 1 is negative 2. And then negative 1 times negative 2 would give you 6. Or would give you 2. And then add it to 4, which is 6. So again, this is not a factor because the remainder is not 0. So then we go on to the next one. So I'm going to try 2 here. So negative 1, 0, 3, 0, 4. Drop down negative 1. 2 times negative 1 is negative 2. Negative 2 times, or negative 2 plus 0 is negative 2. 2 times negative 2 is negative 4. 3 minus 4 is negative 1. When I multiply that, I get negative 2. And then 2 times negative 2 is negative 4. So here I have a remainder of 0, which means that x minus 2 is a real 0. So it's a factor. And then if I wanted to figure out the rest of the factors, I can just use this line here instead of running through my possible list. So this is x minus 2 times negative x squared minus 2x squared, or negative x cubed minus 2x squared minus x minus 2. So here I'm going to factor by grouping. So we're going to get negative x squared times x plus 2. And then I'm going to pull out a negative 1, so I'm left with x plus 2 again. So that was factor by grouping. So now I have to group my terms. So I get negative x squared minus 1, and then x plus 2. So now to find the rest of the zeros, I set them equal to 0. So that means we tee it up. So here, I'm going to get x equals 2. If I set this equal to 0, I add 1 to the other side, divide by negative 1. Notice how you're going to get plus or minus the square root of negative 1. So that's not a real number, so it's not a factor, since it's an imaginary number. And then over here we're going to get x equals negative 2. So the real zeros are 2 and negative 2. One way to double check yourself is to see if those two zeros were in your starting list. So all the way up here, and I see I have plus and minus 2, which means it can be a real factor. So what I want you to do right now is pause the video and try the next example. After you're done, you can come back and check your work. So pause it now because I'm going to scroll down and show you the answer. And then your homework after that is going to be the next two examples. So just so you know, if you do synthetic division and you get let's say x squared plus 4x minus 1 and nothing can factor, don't be afraid to do the quadratic formula too. So you can always use the quadratic formula after you use synthetic division. So right now your only homework is the next two examples.